The lights above the training dome flickered red, and every cadet in the room froze. Mira Calloway did not freeze. She turned toward the sound of the alarm, counted the seconds between flashes, and moved to the nearest wall before anyone else understood what was happening. Instructor Vale Threx watched her from the control platform, arms folded, a thin smile on his pale green face. He had triggered the alarm himself. It was not a real emergency. It was a test, and like every test he designed for her, it was meant to make her fail in front of the class. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying easily through the dome's speakers. "The little Deathworlder jumps at loud noises. How primitive." A few cadets laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughing at Vale's jokes had become a habit. Mira did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the dome's shifting walls, waiting to see what he would throw at her next. This was her 3rd month at the Interstellar Academy for Cadet Species, a school built to train the best young minds from 100 different worlds. Students came from oceans of liquid nitrogen, from cities built inside floating clouds, from deserts where the sand itself could think. Mira came from Earth, and Earth, according to Vale Threx, was a joke. He was Osaran, a species from a soft, quiet planet called Osar Prime, where gravity was gentle, the weather never turned violent, and nothing had hunted his ancestors in 10,000 years. He had built his entire teaching style around one idea, that species from harsh, dangerous worlds, the ones the Academy quietly called Deathworlders, were nothing more than lucky survivors of an ugly evolutionary accident. Not clever, not admirable, just tough, in a way that embarrassed civilized company. And out of every Deathworlder species enrolled that year, Mira Calloway was his favorite target. "Let us see how the little Deathworlder handles a simple obstacle course," Vale announced, tapping a control panel. The dome around Mira reshaped itself, walls rising and falling, forming narrow paths above sudden drops. It was a common training exercise, used on cadets from every species, but Vale had changed the settings. The drops were deeper than standard, the paths were narrower. Mira studied the course for exactly 2 seconds before she started moving. She did not rush. She placed each step with care, reading the angle of every ledge, testing her balance before committing her weight. When a section of floor gave way beneath her, she was already 3 steps ahead of it, having noticed the faint vibration a half-second before it happened. The class, which had been ready to laugh again, went quiet instead. Vale's smile faded slightly. He tapped the panel again. The course grew harder. Walls closed in faster. Gaps widened. A soft hiss filled the dome as cold air poured in, dropping the temperature far below what any of the other cadets had trained in that day. This was not part of the standard lesson. This was something new, something he had added on the spot, watching her from above like a hunter waiting for his prey to stumble. Mira's breath fogged in front of her. Her fingers began to stiffen in the cold. But her mind stayed sharp. She remembered a winter camping trip with her father when she was 12, remembered how he taught her to keep moving, to use her own body heat, to never let the cold decide when she stopped. She kept moving. A cadet named Daniel Foss, sitting near the front with the rest of the class, leaned toward his neighbor. "He's not supposed to change the parameters mid-exercise," he whispered. "That's against training protocol." "Shh," his neighbor whispered back. "Watch her." Mira crossed the last unstable ledge, landed on solid ground, and stood there, breathing hard but steady, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply turned to face Vale Threx, waiting to see what he would do next. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Vale laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed through the dome. "You see?" he said to the class, though his eyes stayed fixed on Mira. "This is exactly what I mean. A Deathworlder does not solve problems with intelligence. It survives through sheer stubbornness, the same way a weed survives in a crack in the pavement. Impressive to look at, perhaps, but nothing to respect." The class laughed again, quieter this time, less certain. Something about the moment had shifted, though none of them could quite name what it was. Mira walked back to her seat without a word. Her hands were still cold, and there was a small bruise forming on her knee, from where she had landed hard on one of the ledges. She sat down, opened her notebook, and began writing, the same way she always did, after one of Vale's demonstrations. Not complaints. Not insults. Just notes. Observations. She had been doing this since her first week at the academy, filling page after page with details most cadets would never bother recording. The exact settings Vale used. The exact moments he changed them. The exact words he chose when he mocked her. Daniel Foss glanced over at her notebook, curious. "Why do you keep writing all that down?" he asked quietly, once Vale had turned his attention to the next lesson. "Because someone should," Mira said, without looking up. "He's not going to stop, you know," Daniel said. "He's been like this since before you got here. He picks a Deathworlder cadet every year and makes them his favorite joke." "I know," Mira said. "Doesn't it bother you?" Mira finally looked up from her notebook. Her expression was calm, almost thoughtful, the way someone looks when they are solving a puzzle, rather than nursing a wound. "It used to," she admitted. "Now I just want to understand him. People like Vale Threx don't laugh at Deathworlders because they think we're weak. They laugh because deep down, they're afraid of what we represent." Daniel frowned. "What do we represent?" "Everything his world never had to face," Mira said simply, and went back to writing. The lesson continued for another hour, though Vale did not target Mira again that day. Instead, he moved on to lecturing about atmospheric composition, his voice dry and bored, as if the earlier demonstration had never happened. But every so often, his eyes flicked toward Mira's side of the room, watching her, studying her the same way she had been studying him. When the class finally ended, cadets filed out of the dome in small groups, chatting about the exercise, about the sudden cold, about how strange it had been to watch a human cross that course without a single misstep. Mira stayed behind for a moment, packing her things slowly, giving the room time to empty. Vale descended from the control platform, his footsteps echoing across the empty floor. He paused near her, his tall, thin frame casting a long shadow across her desk. "You did well today," he said, his tone unreadable. It was almost, close to a compliment. Mira looked up at him. "You changed the settings without warning. That put me at risk." "Risk builds character," Vale said. "Or did your species not learn that lesson on your own miserable little planet?" Mira's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. "There's a difference between a lesson and a setup designed to embarrass someone in front of an entire class." Vale's eyes narrowed slightly, surprised, perhaps, that she had spoken back to him so plainly. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been irritation, or might have been curiosity. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual cool detachment. "We will see how well you handle the next lesson," he said, and walked away without another word. Mira watched him go, then closed her notebook and slipped it into her bag. She had learned, over the past 3 months, that arguing with Vale Threx in the moment rarely accomplished anything. He enjoyed the argument too much. He fed on it, the same way he fed on the laughter of the other cadets. But patience, she had also learned, was its own kind of strength. And she had plenty of it. Outside the training dome, the academy stretched out beneath a sky filled with 3 moons, each one a different color, casting a strange, layered light across the courtyards, where cadets from 100 worlds walked between classes. Mira crossed the courtyard alone, her breath still faintly visible from the cold of the exercise, her mind already turning over everything she had written down that day. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived a hurricane that flattened half her town when she was a child. She thought about her father, who had taught her to read the sky before a storm, to know when the wind meant danger. She thought about every ancestor who had crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and endured winters without heat, all so that one day, a descendant of theirs could stand in an alien classroom and be laughed at for being tough. It was not fair, but fairness, she reminded herself, had never been the point of survival. Adaptation was the point, and if Vale Threx wanted to keep testing her, she would keep adapting, quietly, patiently, until the day came when his jokes finally caught up with him. She did not know yet how soon that day would arrive, but somewhere deep inside her, in the same place that had carried her safely across every unstable ledge in that training dome, she could feel it coming. The next morning, a message appeared on Mira's datapad before she had even finished her breakfast. It was from Daniel Foss, and it contained only 3 words. He did it again. Mira did not need to ask what he meant. She grabbed her bag and hurried across the courtyard toward the training dome, weaving between cadets from a dozen different worlds, some floating, some crawling, some walking on legs that bent in ways human legs never could. When she reached the dome, she found a small crowd already gathered outside, murmuring among themselves. Inside, the dome had been reset for a new kind of exercise. This one was called a survival simulation, a standard part of the Academy's advanced training program. Cadets were placed inside a projected environment, one designed to mimic the conditions of a real planet, and asked to complete a set of tasks without support. It was meant to test problem-solving under pressure, not to punish anyone. But Vale Threx had chosen the environment himself, and everyone in the crowd already suspected what that meant. "He picked Earth," Daniel said quietly, falling into step beside Mira. "He's running an Earth simulation. Says it's for a lesson on gravity wells and predator ecosystems." Mira's stomach tightened, not from fear, but from a familiar, tired frustration. Of course he did. They stepped inside, just as Vale was addressing the class from the control platform. He wore his usual thin smile, the one that always seemed to know something the rest of the room did not. "Today," he announced, "we will explore what the Academy calls a hostile world simulation. Many of you have grown up on gentle, forgiving planets, protected from extremes by fortunate circumstance. It is worth understanding what conditions shape the more, shall we say, resilient species among us." His eyes moved across the room and landed on Mira. "Cadet Calloway will demonstrate first," he said, "since her homeworld happens to be our example today." A ripple of whispers moved through the class. Mira walked forward without hesitation, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. She stepped onto the platform at the center of the dome, and the room around her dissolved into a projected landscape, rolling hills, a distant tree line, a sky heavy with gray clouds. "The simulation will place you in conditions modeled after your own planet's more difficult regions," Vale explained, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "Standard temperature swings, standard predator behavior. Nothing your species has not already survived 1,000 times before, I imagine." The dome shifted around her. Wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant smoke. In the distance, a shape moved through the tree line, low and quick, a projected image of a predator, designed to react to her movements. Mira assessed the environment quickly, the way she had learned to do in every one of Vale's exercises. The terrain sloped downward toward what looked like a river. The tree line offered cover but also blocked her line of sight. The predator was still far off, its movements cautious rather than aggressive. This was, as Vale had said, a standard simulation. Difficult, but fair. She moved toward higher ground, keeping the tree line to her side rather than her back, watching the predator's distant shape without staring directly at it. She built a mental map of the terrain as she walked, marking points where she could find shelter, water, or a defensible position if the simulation escalated. For several minutes, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Then Vale's hand moved across the control panel, and everything changed. The sky darkened suddenly, clouds thickening into a storm that had not been part of the original parameters. Wind speeds doubled. The temperature dropped hard and fast. And in the tree line, not one, but 3 predator shapes appeared, moving with a speed and aggression far beyond the standard settings. Daniel, watching from the crowd, felt his stomach drop. "He's not supposed to do that," he said under his breath. "That's not a standard escalation. That's outside every safety protocol in the manual." Beside him, a cadet from a species with large, sensitive ears flinched at the sound of Vale's quiet laugh drifting from the control platform. Inside the simulation, Mira felt the wind slam into her, cold and sharp, carrying stinging rain that blurred her vision. Her first instinct was fear, a fast, hot flash of it, the same instinct any creature feels when the world suddenly turns dangerous. But instinct was not the same as panic, and Mira had spent her whole life learning the difference. She dropped low, using the terrain's slope to break the worst of the wind. She scanned the tree line, tracking the 3 shapes as they moved, noting their spacing, their pace, the way they seemed to be circling rather than charging directly. Whoever had programmed their behavior wanted her to run in a specific direction, toward what looked like an open field where she would have no cover at all. She refused to take the obvious path. Instead, she moved toward the river, cutting across the slope at an angle that kept the predators guessing. The water would be cold, but cold was survivable. Being caught in the open was not, at least not according to the simulation's rules. She reached the riverbank just as the storm intensified further, visibility dropping to almost nothing. In the crowd, whispers had turned into open concern. Several cadets turned toward the control platform, clearly hoping someone would step in and stop the exercise. Vale ignored them all, his attention locked entirely on the projection of Mira moving through the storm. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to the class. "Let us see just how far the stubbornness runs." He increased the wind speed again. Inside the simulation, Mira staggered as a gust nearly knocked her off her feet. She caught herself against a rock, her hands scraping against its rough surface, and forced herself to keep thinking instead of reacting. The predators were closer now, their shapes cutting through the rain, no longer circling but converging. She thought fast. The river was too dangerous to cross blind in this weather, but a narrow outcropping of rock nearby offered a defensible position, tall enough that the predators would have difficulty reaching her, narrow enough that only one could approach at a time. It was not a perfect solution. It was the best one available. She scrambled up onto the rock just as the first predator shape reached the base of it, snapping and lunging in a burst of projected motion that made half the watching class gasp. Mira did not gasp. She grabbed a loose stone from the rock's surface and threw it hard, striking the predator's projected form squarely, forcing it back a step. She grabbed another stone, and another, keeping her position, refusing to be pulled down from the only stable ground in the entire storm. The simulation was designed to respond to effective resistance by de-escalating, the same way real predator behavior often worked when prey proved too costly to pursue. After several long minutes, the three shapes finally pulled back into the tree line, and the storm around Mira began, slowly, to ease. She stood on the rock for a moment, breathing hard, rain still streaming down her face, and looked directly up at the control platform, at Vale Threx, who was staring back at her, with an expression that had lost all of its earlier amusement. The dome's environment dissolved, the storm vanishing, the hills and trees fading back into the smooth gray walls of the training room. Mira stepped down from the platform on legs that trembled slightly, though her face remained calm. For a long moment, nobody in the class spoke. Then Daniel Foss stepped forward. "That was not part of the standard simulation," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You changed the parameters twice during an active exercise, and you exceeded safety thresholds both times. That's a direct violation of training protocol." Vale's eyes flicked toward him, cold and sharp. "Mind your place, cadet." "I'm required to report protocol violations," Daniel said, standing his ground, despite the visible discomfort on his face. "That's part of my role as class representative." "I'm sorry, Instructor, but I have to report this one." A murmur ran through the crowd, some cadets nodding in quiet agreement, others too nervous to react at all. Vale's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Mira had arrived at the academy, she saw something close to concern cross his features. "Report whatever you like," he said, forcing his usual dismissive tone back into his voice. "The council has better matters to attend to than a training exercise that produced no lasting harm." But his voice, Mira noticed, had lost some of its usual certainty. She gathered her things without a word, her clothes still damp from the simulated storm, and walked out of the dome ahead of the rest of the class. Daniel caught up with her just outside, his expression a mixture of worry and determination. "I'm filing the report today," he said. "I should have done it weeks ago, honestly. This has gone on long enough." "Thank you," Mira said quietly. "Are you all right?" Mira looked down at her hands, still faintly red from the cold of the simulation. "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it, though something in her voice suggested she was thinking about more than just the exercise itself. "But I think this is only the beginning of something bigger." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean Vale Threx just crossed a line in front of witnesses," Mira said. "And people like him don't stop mocking others because they suddenly develop kindness. They stop because someone finally makes them face the truth about what they've been doing." She looked back toward the training dome, where Vale's tall, thin shape was still visible through the entrance, standing alone on the control platform, staring at the space where the simulation had been. "And I think," Mira added quietly. That truth is coming for him sooner than he realizes. That evening, alone in her small dormitory room, Mira sat at her desk and opened her notebook once more. She wrote down every detail of the day's exercise, the exact wind speeds, the exact predator behaviors, the exact moment Vale had escalated the simulation beyond its intended limits. She wrote down Daniel's promise to file a report. She wrote down her own thoughts, carefully, honestly, about what it meant to be laughed at for surviving. Outside her window, the 3 moons cast their strange colored light across the academy grounds, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the quiet hum of the campus settling into night. She closed her notebook, set it on the desk beside her, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small, tired smile. Vale Threx had spent months building his reputation on the idea that Deathworlders were nothing more than lucky survivors, undeserving of respect. Tomorrow, that reputation would be tested in front of people who had the power to do something about it, and Mira intended to make sure that when the moment came, she would be ready. 3 days later, a formal summons appeared on Mira's datapad, requesting her presence before the Academy Council. The message was brief and official, listing only a time, a location, and a case number attached to Daniel Foss's protocol report. Mira read it twice, then set the pad down and stared out her window for a long moment, gathering her thoughts before the day ahead. She had expected the summons. What she had not expected was how quickly it had arrived. The council chamber sat at the heart of the academy, a wide circular room beneath a domed ceiling, made entirely of transparent crystal, through which the light of a distant star filtered down in soft, shifting patterns. 7 seats formed a raised half-circle at the front of the room, each one occupied by a senior educator representing a different region of known space. At the center sat Chancellor Oren Kell, an elderly figure from a species known for long lifespans and careful, deliberate speech. Mira arrived early, dressed simply, her notebook tucked under one arm. Daniel Foss was already there, along with 2 other cadets who had witnessed the exercise and agreed to speak if asked. Vale Threx arrived last, walking with the same confident stride he always used in his own classroom, as though the summons were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Instructor Threx," Chancellor Kell said, once the chamber had settled into silence. "You have been called before this council to answer a formal complaint regarding repeated violations of training protocol, specifically the unauthorized escalation of simulation parameters beyond established safety limits, targeting a specific cadet on multiple occasions." Vale inclined his head slightly, his expression calm, almost bored. "Chancellor, with respect, I believe this complaint stems from a misunderstanding. My teaching methods are rigorous, yes, but rigor is not the same as misconduct. Cadet Calloway completed every exercise without harm. If anything, the results demonstrate the very resilience I sought to illustrate." Several of the council members exchanged glances. One of them, a counselor named Celavray, leaned forward slightly. "The report indicates that safety thresholds were exceeded twice during a single exercise, without prior authorization. That is not a matter of teaching style, Instructor. That is a documented violation." "A violation with no lasting harm," Vale replied smoothly. "I would remind the council that Deathworlder species are, by definition, built to withstand conditions far more extreme than anything our training domes can simulate. If I pushed the boundaries slightly further than usual, it was only to properly illustrate a point about evolutionary resilience, a topic directly relevant to our curriculum." Chancellor Kell's expression remained neutral, but his eyes moved thoughtfully across the room. "And is it your position, Instructor Threx, that a cadet species determines how much risk is acceptable to impose upon them without consent?" Vale hesitated, just slightly, before answering. "I would not phrase it in such extreme terms, Chancellor. I simply believe that species accustomed to hardship benefit from training that reflects that hardship. It would be a disservice to coddle them with the same gentle standards we apply to more, let us say, delicate species." A quiet murmur passed through the chamber. Mira, standing near the back with Daniel and the other witnesses, felt her jaw tighten, though she kept her expression steady. She had heard variations of this argument from Vale many times before. Hearing it repeated here, in front of the council, in the same dismissive tone he used in the classroom, struck her differently. It was no longer just an insult aimed at her. It was a belief system. one he had clearly held for a very long time, and one that had likely shaped how he treated every Deathworlder cadet who had ever passed through his classroom. CouncilHFY studied Vale for a long moment before speaking again. "Instructor, do you have documentation showing that Cadet Calloway consented to these altered parameters in advance?" "Consent is not typically required for standard training exercises," Vale said. "These were not standard exercises," Chancellor Kell said quietly. "According to the report, they exceeded standard parameters significantly, without authorization, and without warning to the cadet involved." Vale's composure flickered, just barely, a small crack in the confident mask he had worn since entering the chamber. "Chancellor, if I may, I believe the true issue here is not one of protocol, but of perception. This council, like much of the Academy, exists within a framework shaped by comfortable worlds. It is easy, from such a position, to view firmness as cruelty. I would ask the council to consider that what looks like harshness from the outside may, in fact, be the very thing that prepares a cadet for the realities their species has always faced." It was, Mira realized, a clever argument, one designed to shift the conversation away from his own behavior and toward a broader philosophical debate, one where the council, being members of gentle worlds themselves, might feel uncertain about pushing back too hard against a defense built on respecting difficult realities. For a moment, the chamber fell silent, several council members exchanging uncertain glances. Mira felt a flicker of frustration rise in her chest. This was exactly what Vale did best, turning every accusation into a debate he could control, using confident words to blur the line between genuine concern and simple prejudice. Chancellor Kell's gaze moved slowly across the chamber, before settling on Mira. "Cadet Calloway," he said, "you are the subject of this complaint, and you have not yet spoken. Do you wish to address the council?" Mira stepped forward, her notebook still tucked under her arm, her steps calm and unhurried, despite the sudden weight of every eye in the chamber turning toward her. "I do, Chancellor," she said. "Thank you." She reached the open space at the center of the chamber, where cadets were traditionally permitted to address the council directly. For a moment, she said nothing, simply standing there, gathering her thoughts, aware of Vale's eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled challenge. "Instructor Threx has spent this hearing describing his actions as a form of respect," Mira began, her voice steady and clear. "He says he pushes Deathworlder cadets harder because our worlds shaped us to handle hardship, and that treating us gently would somehow be an insult to that history. I would like to address that claim directly, because I don't think the council fully understands what that history actually involved." She opened her notebook, not to read from it, but simply to hold it, a quiet anchor as she continued. "My planet, like every Deathworlder world represented at this academy, did not become dangerous by accident," she said. "Earth has experienced ice ages that lasted for tens of thousands of years, forcing early humans to migrate across entire continents just to survive the cold. It has experienced sudden climate shifts that wiped out species far larger and far stronger than humans ever were. My ancestors lived alongside predators capable of ending a human life in seconds, with no weapons beyond sharpened stone and simple courage. They survived plagues that killed a third of entire populations, famines that lasted for generations, and storms that could level a city in a single night." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. "Every trait Instructor Threx has mocked in his classroom, our fast reflexes, our instinct to notice danger before it fully arrives, our stubborn refusal to stop moving, even when conditions turn against us, exists because countless generations of humans did not have the luxury of stopping. They adapted, or they did not survive long enough to have descendants. That is not primitive. That is not a lucky accident. That is the result of an unimaginable amount of loss, endured over hundreds of thousands of years, refined into instincts that now live inside every human being, including me." CouncilHFY leaned forward slightly, listening closely. Chancellor Kell's expression remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened with genuine attention. "Instructor Threx comes from a world where none of that was ever necessary," Mira continued. "Osar Prime has no history of ice ages, no dangerous predators, no violent storms capable of reshaping the land. That is not something to be ashamed of. Comfort is not a flaw, But comfort also does not grant automatic wisdom about hardship it has never experienced. When Instructor Threx describes his treatment of Deathworlder cadets as a form of respect, I would ask the Council to consider a simpler explanation. Perhaps it is not respect at all. Perhaps it is something closer to distance. The kind of distance that makes it easy to laugh at struggles you have never personally faced. She turned slightly, addressing not just the Council now, but the entire chamber, her voice carrying without needing to rise. I do not believe Instructor Threx set out to cause harm, she said. I believe he built his teaching style around a story that made him feel comfortable, a story where hardship makes a species less worthy of gentleness, rather than more deserving of understanding. But that story is not true. And repeating it in a classroom, especially while altering safety protocols to prove a point, does real harm to real cadets who deserve to learn without being turned into a lesson about their own suffering. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished. Even Vale, who had spent the entire hearing composed and confident, seemed at a loss for words, his usual sharp reply nowhere to be found. Chancellor Kell studied Mira for a long moment, his ancient eyes thoughtful. Cadet Calloway, he said finally, your account is detailed, and your reasoning is sound. Do you have anything further to add before the Council deliberates? Mira glanced briefly at Daniel, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, then back at the Council. Only this, she said. Instructor Threx asked the Council to consider that firmness is sometimes mistaken for cruelty. I would ask the Council to consider the opposite possibility as well. That mockery, repeated often enough, dressed up in confident language, can sometimes be mistaken for firmness. I believe that is what has happened here. She closed her notebook, stepped back, and returned to her place beside Daniel, leaving the chamber in a silence unlike any Mira had experienced since arriving at the academy. For the first time, Vale Threx had nothing clever to say. Chancellor Kell exchanged a quiet glance with the other council members before speaking again. This council will take a short recess to deliberate, he announced. Instructor Threx, Cadet Calloway, please remain available. We will reconvene shortly with our decision. As the council members rose and filed toward a side chamber, Mira felt the weight of the room's silence settle around her, heavier now, filled with something she had not expected to feel this soon, the quiet, uncertain beginning of victory. The recess lasted longer than anyone expected. Mira sat quietly on a bench near the edge of the chamber, her notebook resting on her lap, while Daniel paced nearby, too restless to sit still. Across the room, Vale Threx stood alone, his back straight, his expression unreadable, though the confident ease he had carried into the chamber earlier had noticeably faded. Do you think they'll actually do something? Daniel asked quietly, sitting down beside her at last. I don't know, Mira admitted, but I think something changed in that room today. Even if the council doesn't punish him the way we hope, I don't think Vale Threx will be able to walk back into his classroom and pretend nothing happened. Daniel glanced toward the alien instructor, who was staring out through the crystal dome above, seemingly lost in thought. He looks like a man who just realized the ground under him isn't as solid as he thought. Mira followed his gaze. Good, she said quietly. It's about time. Nearly an hour passed before the side chamber doors opened again, and the 7 council members returned to their seats. The murmuring in the room fell silent almost instantly, every cadet and observer turning toward the raised platform, waiting. Chancellor Kell folded his hands in front of him and let his gaze sweep slowly across the chamber before speaking. This council has reached a decision, he said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. We have reviewed the formal report filed by Cadet Foss, the testimony of witnesses present during the exercises in question, and the statements given today by both Instructor Threx and Cadet Calloway. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch, before continuing. First, regarding the protocol violations. The evidence is clear and undisputed. Instructor Threx altered simulation parameters beyond authorized safety limits on multiple occasions, without prior approval, and without warning to the cadet involved. This is a direct violation of Academy training standards, regardless of the instructor's stated intentions. Vale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For this violation, Chancellor Kell continued, Instructor Threx is formally reprimanded, and his authorization to conduct live simulation exercises is suspended pending a full review by the Training Safety Board. He will be required to complete additional certification before resuming any hands-on instruction involving simulated environments. A quiet ripple moved through the observers gathered along the chamber's edges. Daniel let out a slow breath beside Mira, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. But CouncilHFY was not finished. "Second," he said, his tone shifting, growing more serious. "This council has become aware, through today's testimony, of a broader pattern extending well beyond a single set of protocol violations. Cadet Calloway's account, along with corroborating statements gathered from other cadets over the course of this hearing, indicates that Instructor Threx has repeatedly used his classroom as a platform to disparage students from what this academy classifies as high-hazard origin worlds." He turned his gaze directly toward Vale. "This council takes seriously its responsibility to ensure that every cadet, regardless of origin, receives an education free from ridicule based on their species or homeworld. The comments attributed to you today, Instructor Threx, describing certain cadets as products of, and I quote from the record, an ugly evolutionary accident, are inconsistent with the values this institution was founded upon." Vale's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flicker of something defensive crossing his pale green features. "Chancellor, with respect, those comments were made in the context of academic discussion, not personal attack. Words spoken repeatedly, in front of an audience, targeting the same category of students, cease to be academic discussion the moment they cause genuine harm," CouncilHFY replied evenly. "This council has heard enough today to conclude that harm has, in fact, occurred." He glanced briefly toward Mira before continuing. "It is worth noting that Cadet Calloway did not request punishment for Instructor Threx during her testimony. She spoke instead about understanding, about the difference between hardship and disrespect. This council finds her perspective worth reflecting upon, not only in this specific case, but in how this institution approaches the education of Deathworlder cadets more broadly." CouncilHFY spoke next, her voice quieter, but no less firm. "Effective immediately, Instructor Threx's lecture materials will be reviewed by the Curriculum Board to ensure they meet the Academy's standards for respectful, balanced instruction. Additionally, a formal apology will be issued to Cadet Calloway and to any other cadets who experienced similar treatment during Instructor Threx's tenure." Vale stood rigid at the center of the chamber, his usual confident posture replaced by something far more uncertain. For the first time since Mira had met him, he looked genuinely at a loss, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to respond to a room that was no longer laughing along with him. "This council does not take pleasure in disciplining any of its instructors," CouncilHFY said, his tone softening slightly. "Instructor Threx has, by most accounts, been a capable and knowledgeable teacher for many years, but knowledge without respect is an incomplete education, and this institution exists to prepare cadets not only to survive among the stars, but to understand and honor the differences between the worlds they come from." He turned his attention fully toward Mira now, his ancient eyes warm with something close to admiration. "Cadet Calloway, this council wishes to formally acknowledge the clarity and integrity of your testimony today. It is rare that a cadet stands before this chamber and offers not only evidence, but genuine wisdom." "We are grateful for it." Mira inclined her head respectfully, though she said nothing, unsure of how to respond to praise she had not expected to receive. "This hearing is concluded," CouncilHFY announced, rising from his seat, the other council members following in turn. "Instructor Threx, you will report to the Safety Review Board within the week. Cadet Calloway, Cadet Foss, thank you both for bringing this matter forward with honesty and courage." As the council filed out of the chamber, the room slowly filled with quiet conversation, cadets and observers turning to one another, some in surprise, others in quiet satisfaction. Daniel turned to Mira, a wide grin breaking across his face. "They actually did it," he said. "I honestly wasn't sure they would." "Neither was I," Mira admitted, though a small, tired smile had finally found its way onto her own face. Across the chamber, Vale Threx remained standing alone for a long moment, watching the council members disappear through the side doors, his expression difficult to read. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward Mira, his steps far less confident than they had been at the start of the hearing. He stopped a short distance away, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I did not expect that," he said finally, his voice quieter than Mira had ever heard it. "Which part?" Mira asked. "Any of it," Vale admitted. "I did not expect the council to rule so firmly. And I did not expect you to speak the way you did. I expected anger. I expected accusations. What I heard instead was something closer to understanding, offered to someone who, by any reasonable measure, did not deserve it." Mira studied him for a moment before answering. "I don't think you're a cruel person, Instructor Threx. I think you built a story about the universe that made you comfortable, and you never had a reason to question it until now. That doesn't excuse what you did. But it does mean there's a difference between you and someone who enjoys causing harm for its own sake." Vale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the crystal dome above, where the light of the distant star continued its slow, shifting pattern across the chamber. "My world has never known hardship," he said finally, almost to himself. "I have spent my life studying species who have, and somewhere along the way, I mistook that distance for superiority, instead of simply what it was. Luck." "That's a start," Mira said quietly. He looked back at her, something unfamiliar in his expression, something that might, given time, grow into genuine humility. "I owe you an apology, Cadet Calloway, a real one, not the formal statement the council will require of me." "I'd like to hear it," Mira said, "but not today. Today, I think you have a lot to think about." Vale nodded slowly, accepting the fairness of that answer. "Perhaps I do," he said. And for the first time since Mira had arrived at the academy, he offered her something that was not a smile of amusement, but something closer to respect. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his steps slower, more thoughtful than the confident stride he had entered with. Mira watched him go, then turned back to Daniel, who was still grinning beside her. "Well," Daniel said, "that's certainly one way to end a training exercise." Mira laughed, a real laugh, tired, but genuine, the first one she had allowed herself in weeks. "Let's just say I prefer this ending to the last one," she said, and together they walked out of the council chamber, leaving behind a hearing that would soon become the most talked-about event the Academy had seen in years. News of the hearing spread across the Academy faster than Mira expected. By the following morning, cadets she had never spoken to were nodding to her in the hallways, some offering quiet words of encouragement, others simply watching her with a new kind of curiosity, as if trying to understand how a single human cadet had managed to hold her ground in front of the entire council. She did not enjoy the attention. She had never wanted to become a symbol of anything. But she understood, walking across the courtyard that morning, beneath the shifting light of the 3 moons, that something larger than her own situation had shifted inside the Academy's walls, and there was no undoing it now. In the days that followed, the curriculum board completed its review of Vale Threx's lecture materials, exactly as Chancellor Kell had promised. Entire sections of his teaching notes were flagged for revision, passages that framed Deathworlder species as lesser, primitive, or unworthy of full respect. Vale did not fight the changes. According to Daniel, who had quietly kept an ear on the process through his role as class representative, the instructor had cooperated fully, offering no argument, no clever rebuttal, nothing of the confident defiance he had shown during the hearing itself. Mira found this harder to believe than the council's ruling. She had expected Vale to resist, to find some new angle, some new justification for his old beliefs. Instead, he seemed to disappear from the Academy's social spaces almost entirely, spending his free hours alone, rarely seen outside his required duties. It was nearly 2 weeks later, on a quiet afternoon between classes, that Mira found him sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the training dome, staring out at nothing in particular. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, before deciding that avoiding him now would only prolong something that deserved to be finished properly. "You've been keeping to yourself," she said, sitting down at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. Vale glanced at her, his expression tired in a way she had never seen before. "I have been thinking," he said. "It is not a pleasant process, reconsidering years of assumptions all at once." "No," Mira agreed. "I imagine it isn't." They sat in silence for a moment, watching a group of younger cadets practice basic maneuvers on the far side of the courtyard. their laughter drifting faintly across the open space. "I grew up believing my world was simply better," Vale said finally, his voice quiet, almost confessional. "Not through any effort of my own, simply because it was gentle, because it never demanded anything difficult of anyone who lived there. I mistook that gentleness for achievement. I looked at species who had survived far worse conditions than mine, and instead of recognizing the strength that required, I saw only inconvenience, only roughness, only things that made me uncomfortable to witness." Mira listened quietly, letting him speak without interruption. "You said something in the council chamber that I have not been able to stop thinking about," he continued. "You said that comfort does not grant automatic wisdom, about hardship it has never faced. I have spent my entire career believing the opposite, that my comfort made me qualified to judge the value of other people's struggles. I was wrong. It takes a lot to admit that," Mira said. "Most people never do." Vale turned to look at her fully for the first time since she had sat down. "I owe you the apology I promised," he said. "Not the formal statement I gave to the council, though I meant every word of that as well. I owe you an apology for treating your resilience as a joke, when in truth, it was the very thing that allowed you to survive my worst efforts to embarrass you, and to answer them with more grace than I deserved." Mira considered his words carefully before responding. "I accept your apology," she said, "but I think the person who really needs to hear it isn't me. It's every Deathworlder cadet who sat in your classroom before I arrived, and never had the chance to stand in front of the council the way I did." Vale's expression grew thoughtful. "You're right," he admitted. "I intend to reach out to as many former students as I can locate. It will not undo what was said, but perhaps it will mean something, coming from someone who has finally understood how wrong he was." "That's a good place to start," Mira said. They sat together for a while longer, the silence between them no longer heavy with old tension, but something closer to a fragile, developing understanding. Eventually, Vale spoke again, his tone lighter, almost curious. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. During the hearing, you said that comfort was not something to be ashamed of. Given everything I put you through, I confess I expected far more anger from you than understanding. Why did you choose to speak the way you did?" Mira thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because anger might have won the argument," she said, "but it wouldn't have changed anything. You needed to understand why you were wrong, not just be told that you were. My ancestors didn't survive by being angry at the world for being difficult. They survived by understanding it, adapting to it, and eventually building something better because of what they learned. I figured the same approach might work on you." Vale studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. "I believe it did," he said quietly. Over the following months, the atmosphere in the academy shifted in small but meaningful ways. Vale Threx returned to teaching once his certification review was complete, but his classroom looked nothing like it once had. Gone were the mocking jokes, the casual jabs aimed at Deathworlder cadets, the dismissive tone that had once defined every lecture. In their place, Mira noticed something she had not expected to see. Genuine curiosity, careful questions asked with real interest, an instructor slowly learning to see strength in places he had once only seen inconvenience. Other instructors, watching the outcome of the hearing, quietly reconsidered their own teaching habits as well, a ripple effect that Chancellor Kell later described, during a brief address to the Academy, as one of the most important shifts in institutional culture in decades. Mira did not seek credit for any of it. She continued her studies quietly, focused on her own growth, rather than the reputation that had followed her since the hearing. But cadets from other Deathworlder species, students she had never met before, began seeking her out in the following weeks, some simply to thank her, others to ask for advice on handling instructors of their own who carried similar prejudices, though perhaps not as extreme as Vale's had once been. Daniel Foss remained her closest friend throughout it all, the two of them often studying together in the Academy's quiet library, trading stories about their respective homeworlds, comparing the strange, difficult, beautiful histories that had shaped their species long before either of them had been born. One evening, nearly 6 months after the hearing, Mira found herself back in the training dome, standing on the same platform where Vale had once triggered a storm meant to embarrass her. The dome was empty now, The lights dimmed for the evening, and she stood there for a long moment, remembering the fear she had felt that day, the cold, the shapes moving through the tree line, the quiet certainty that she needed to keep thinking instead of panicking. Vale's voice startled her softly from the entrance. "I did not expect to find you here at this hour." Mira turned, offering him a small smile. "I like to remember where things started sometimes. It helps me appreciate how far things have come." He walked further into the dome, his steps calm, unhurried, nothing like the confident stride he had once used to intimidate his students. "I have been meaning to tell you," he said. "The curriculum board has approved a new course for next term, one focused on cross-species resilience and survival history, taught from the perspective of the species themselves rather than outside assumption. They have asked me to help develop it." Mira raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "That's a big change." "It is," Vale agreed. "And I would like to ask you something, if you are willing to consider it. Would you be willing to contribute to the course, not as a subject to be studied, but as a voice to help shape how it is taught?" Mira considered the offer for a long moment, thinking about her ancestors, about the ice ages and storms, and quiet, stubborn survival that had shaped her species long before the Academy had ever existed. She thought about every Deathworlder cadet who might one day sit in a classroom very different from the one she had first walked into, and how much it might mean for them to learn about their own history with respect instead of ridicule. "I would be honored," she said finally. Vale nodded, something like genuine gratitude crossing his features. "Then perhaps," he said, "something good can grow from all of this, after all." Mira looked around the empty dome one last time, remembering the storm, the cold, the silence that had followed her testimony in the council chamber, and the long, quiet road that had led from that single mocking joke to this moment, standing beside an instructor who had finally learned to listen. "I think it already has," she said, and together they walked out of the dome, beneath a sky filled with 3 shifting moons, toward whatever the Academy still had left to teach them both.